Preempting means the legislature takes away our ability to regulate certain areas. And I've given you a handout. We basically boiled it down to the top 10 bills that we're opposing at this point. TML is actually opposing about 155 bills at this point that have moved out of committee. But we thought that was a bit too many to run by you guys today. So we kind of narrowed it down to the top 10. I'm going to briefly go through these 10 bills. I won't spend a lot of time on each one. And then we'll turn it over to the mayors one by one to tell you about some of those bills that they care about, and also this general issue of attacking Texas cities, which seems to be on the rise the last few sessions. I want to introduce my mayors today. To my left is Mayor Steve Adler, the mayor of Austin. Mayor Adler is going to sort of represent the large city perspective. To his left is Mary Dennis, the mayor of Live Oak, Texas, former TML president. Live Oak is a suburb of San Antonio, and we wanted Mary to sort of talk about the suburban issues and how they are slightly different than large and small cities. And to her left is Stephen Haynes, the mayor of Brownwood, Texas. And Stephen will talk about a smaller city and a more rural perspective. But really, these preemption bills affect all cities, so we're all in this together, and we all feel the same about these bills. So let me start out running down the list. We have the revenue cap bill, Senate Bill 2 and House Bill 2. I won't spend much time on this because you guys know about this. This lowers property tax rollback rate to as little as 2.5% in some versions, 3.5% in as it passed the Senate last week. Our handout makes the case that Texas cities are not the problem with property tax. We tend to be sort of the scapegoat for the problems that the state has with funding schools. The next bill down is one that's not getting a lot of press, but we're very concerned about, and that is the cable and telecom franchise fee bill. Private companies have to, under the Constitution, have to rent public space at market value. This bill tosses that on its head and basically lets cable and telecom companies cut their franchise fees to cities, their right-of-way rental fees, in half. This bill will cost Houston almost $27 million. It'll cost Dallas about $9 million, and then a sliding scale on downward. TML's current president-elect is from the small town of Staples down near San Marcos. They don't have a property tax, so these franchise fees are 70% of that mayor's city revenues. There's two bills here that I'm lumping together, and we're calling them super preemption. These are very dangerous bills that would say cities have almost no authority over local businesses. The first bill says any business that has locations in more than one Texas city is exempt from most city regulations. The way we read this bill, no more payday lending ordinances, no more sexually oriented business ordinances, noise ordinances. These types of things could be off the table under this first bill. The second bill says that you can't regulate anybody or any occupation who has a state license of any sort. So anybody in a restaurant, for example, has state licensing, banking, and so forth. So this would take any number of city regulations off the books. Again, payday lending, sexually oriented business, even oil and gas drilling ordinances, potentially. The next bill on our list is what we call, if you can't beat them, silence them type legislation, and this bill has some momentum. Senate Bill 29 passed the Senate last week. It basically says that cities, counties, school districts cannot join organizations or pay dues to organizations that attempt to influence legislation. So it would outlaw my organization. It'd make my job a little bit easier, that's for sure, but it would prevent me from being a spokesperson on behalf of the mayors you see at the front of the room. They're going to have a lot to say about that, I'm sure. House Bill 3778 would totally preempt city regulation over short-term rentals. These are the Airbnb and other type online apps. This is an interesting case. This is, the state legislators talk about wanting to have uniformity across the state. This is the perfect subject matter for why we don't need uniformity. We have a handful of cities that are having tremendous problems with owner-occupied short-term rentals. Austin, Arlington, Grapevine, Galveston, and we have hundreds of other cities that could care less, will choose never to regulate this issue. So it's a perfect example of why the patchwork quilt is good for Texas cities. And I know Mayor Adler will have some things to say about that. House Bill 347 is completely eliminating annexation for all the small counties. Last session we saw that for the larger counties. This bill would just bring every other city into compliance. House Bill 969 is an interesting bill that we couldn't figure out for several months. It says cities can't regulate noxious plants. We didn't know what a noxious plant was, but the more we studied that bill, we realized This is a backdoor effort to do the tree preservation ordinance legislation that did not pass last session. A number of Texas cities, including those in the Hill Country, have heritage tree ordinances. This bill would preempt those ordinances and say that an owner can cut down their tree under any circumstance. House Bill 2439 by Representative Phelan is a particularly dangerous bill that says cities cannot regulate building materials, either external or interior, as long as those building materials are mentioned in one of the international building codes. Well, those international building codes mention all kinds of materials, plywood, sheetrock, and other things. And you could build a house out of metal in a brick neighborhood, you could, and vice versa. It's a very dangerous bill that would preempt city building codes and masonry ordinances and other examples of things like that. The final bill I'm going to mention, and I'll turn it over to our mayors to talk about which of these issues they care about, is a particularly bad firefighting bill. This bill would say that all Texas cities essentially have civil service rules for disciplining firefighters. Civil service is for larger cities that have a complex administrative apparatus that can handle appeals and discipline. This would say even a city of 3 firefighters, you have to go through the same civil service rules that an Austin or a Dallas has to face trying to discipline a firefighter. So particularly bad for our smaller cities. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is 10 of the worst bills. It's kind of a cross-section of what we're facing this session. Like I said, we're opposing over 150 different bad ideas for Texas cities at this point. And now I want to turn it over to our mayors. We'll start with Mayor Adler. He'll tell you a little bit about some of these issues that he cares the most about. Then we'll hear from Mayor Dennis, and then finally Mayor Haynes. Mayor?
Thank you. It's an honor to be here today with my colleagues, with the Texas Municipal League, speaking about this session, which I think is one which is more focused on attacking cities than any session that I can remember. I'm from Austin, and certainly we have a history of being at odds with the legislature on issues from time to time. But I think that what we're seeing happen this time is different. We now have an assault, I think, which is being waged against all cities, not just any one or two. And that assault is not dealing just at the periphery of issues, but it is dealing at cities in a most direct way with the revenue cap bill. Most people in Texas live in cities. Cities, frankly, are the incubators for innovation and the engines for economic development that is driving the large measure of the economy in Texas right now. The cities are doing incredibly well relative to cities in other states around the country. Austin, for example, was just listed for the 3rd time in a row as the most livable city, best city to live in by U.S. News and World Report. But we're performing well. Our unemployment rate is a full point below the unemployment rate in the state. You would think that with cities doing as well as Texas cities are, that the state legislature would congratulate them for what they're doing, encourage them to keep doing whatever it is that they're doing and to keep it up. But that's not the case. And from a policy standpoint, it's real difficult to understand why the state looks like it could weigh in ways that would stop the progress that's happening at cities and fundamentally disrupt the good that the cities are doing on behalf of the state. Principal among, I think, those bills that we're considering is the revenue cap bill. That came out of committee in the House with a 2.5% cap, and out of the Senate at a 3.5% cap. This is a concept or an idea that would cost city budgets millions and millions of dollars and result in virtually no tax relief or reform for anyone in just about any city in Texas. There are elements of that bill that I think many cities support. The increased transparency with respect to taxes and who's paying what and who's charging what and what's increasing. We're all in favor of that here in Austin because we think one of the problems that exists right now is that many of the taxpayers, and I think some of the legislators, don't fully understand why it is that we're having the property tax challenge that we have. Here in Austin, 72% of the property tax increase that we are feeling in this city, and it is way too big, this property tax increase, but 72% of what we're feeling is as a direct and sole result of the school taxes, which are continue to rise because the state will not fundamentally fix the school finance system. I applaud Senate Bill 3 and House Bill 3 because they're doing good things for helping to fund some schools, but they are doing nothing to fundamentally impact the structural issues. And my fear, even with those bills, and I hope they pass, I hope they do, but there's no reason to believe we're not going to be back here again in 4 or 6 years because we're not fundamentally changing the structure. But again, in Central Texas, in Austin, 72% of the increase that we're seeing is as a direct result of school tax increases. If we were not looking at those school tax increases, we would not be having the conversation about property taxes being out of control. The out of control property tax governmental entity is the state, and they tax citizens through school districts by having a finance system that won't let school districts lower their rate when property values increase, which is something that cities and counties do. It is not a function of Austin being a rich school district and having Robin Hood, because quite frankly, if you look at all the other school districts that Austin touch, the increase in their property taxes have gone up similarly to the increase that you see with the Austin Independent School District. But Senate Bill 2 and House Bill 2, with the caps they propose, House Bill 2 has a 2.5% cap, would have our city upside down by over $50 million in 3 years if we do nothing more than keep our existing budget and carry it forward with things that are inherent in that budget. Over $50 million. And the reason for that is that we expect health insurance, health coverage to go up. We have wage inflation. We have regular inflation. The leases that we pay for office space and space that we rent is going up. And what we've been told is we should expect a 3.8% increase year to year on our existing budget if we keep and maintain that existing budget. A cap of 2.5% is not a cap on total revenue, it's a cap only on property tax revenue. And in the city of Austin, only half of our revenue comes from property taxes. The other half comes from other sources which are forecast to go up at 2%. So a 2.5% property tax cap is a 2.25% revenue cap. A 3.5% property tax cap is a 2.75% cap on revenue generally, because it's only half the revenue, and the other half of the revenue is going up by 2%. Neither of those will cover my 3.8% cost drivers, which is why I'm upside down by over $50 million under House Bill 2 at 2.5%, over $35 million under Senate Bill 2 at 3.5%. And what do my taxpayers get for that? Under House Bill 2, the typical taxpayer would save $2.70 a month. Under Senate Bill 2, the typical taxpayer homeowner in my city would save $1.80 a month. We lose tens of millions of dollars with very little property tax relief. Our city, like many cities, most cities across the state, the public safety expense is 60, 65, 70% of our budgets. It's almost 70% in Austin. 80% of that is people. 80% is people. I'm not going to be able to cut $50 million plus out of my budget, or $35 million plus out of my budget without impacting public safety. I'll give you an example. At the last contract we entered into with our law enforcement. We promised the community that we would add 30 more officers a year over the next the next 5 years in order to improve community policing. That would be a new program. And the deficit numbers I gave you a moment ago assume I keep my existing budget. There's no way I'm going to be able to do new programs like that without having to make even more substantial cuts in other areas. So I would just want to conclude, so I'm not taking up all.
Can we ask? I mean, I think that.
Can we save the questions to the end? Could we let the mayors each make the quick remarks, do you mind?
I would just conclude by saying that many of these bills are going to have a real significant impact on cities. I can't find any policy to support these bills or the revenue caps. These actions are untethered to sound public policy. Cities are in trouble. What we're asking for the legislature to do with respect to revenue caps is to build in a protection for public safety, build in a protection for economic development expenses, Chapter 380 and 312, Chapter 312 agreements, build in protections for roads, build in protections for border security, build in protections for our shared priorities, cities and states where we are totally aligned. Build in those protections so that cities aren't forced to make cuts.
Thanks, Mayor. Mayor Dennis, do you have some?
Oh, thank you so much. Certainly, we appreciate you all being here and taking your time to listen to us today to get the word out about many bills, most of them bad, are for cities. So thank you very much for your time today. Mayor Adler, I was just going to start by saying that explains why my city manager spends every weekend in Austin, because he thinks it's a great city too. So we appreciate your leadership. Thank you, Mayor Haynes, for being here. I was asked to pick out maybe the 3 worst bills from this list of 10. And I'm afraid I looked at it and I was like, I can't find 3 because all 10 of them are bad, plus the ones that were not even included on this list. It amazes me that Texas is such a great state that we, I think of all states, show the country how to bring good companies to our state, how to provide good paying jobs for our residents. And we appreciate the work that the state does, and their job is taking care of the state. What we're asking simply is we as elected officials, let us do the job that we were elected to do, and that's to provide city services to our cities. And we're able to do that because of the way the system is set. So why bother something that's not broken? And that's been my question for a number of years as president of the TML organization 2 years ago. Being here in Austin those 2 years ago, I'm saying, what's wrong with the 8%? Why do we even need the cap? What is the reason for it? We all want property tax relief. We are property owners ourselves, but let it be something that's really real. I love the numbers that you quoted. We ran the numbers for our city, and it was about $3.50 annually for our residents to save. That's not even a cup of coffee at Starbucks. Come on, really? You call that property tax relief? Well, if you want to give property tax relief, let's look at where the problem is, and that's in the school financing. And so as I looked at this list, certainly we are against and very concerned about the lobbying, the SB 29 and the HB 281. It's really crazy to me that Austin sends people to Washington, D.C. to lobby on their behalf, yet they're saying to cities that we don't want to give you that same type of option. So it's very important that we have the voice of TML, one of the organizations that does represent our cities, to be able to look at the nearly 7,000 bills. Most of us work. A lot of us have jobs outside of serving in these public places. We don't have the time or the capacity to be able to go through nearly 7,000 bills to say these are good, these are bad. So we appreciate the work that the Texas Municipal League does on behalf of Texas cities. So that's a crazy thing even to consider. The one with the cable telecom, it's against the law for us to give anything of public value away. Why then are we going to give this to the telecom companies? It doesn't even make sense to me. But just so many bad things that are going on, but we appreciate, again, the work that the Texas Municipal League does, and we appreciate your being here, getting the full story out. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mayor. Mayor Haynes, you have some comments?
I do. First of all, again, I want to also thank Mayor Adler and Mayor Dennis. It's certainly a pleasure and an opportunity, a great opportunity for me to be here and speak on behalf of sort of the rural markets. One of the things I really want to emphasize is how diverse our state is. It's a joke among other states, right, about how large our state is and how populous it is and how long it takes to get across the state. For me to drive to Amarillo, Texas, if I was in the Northeast, I would drive across 4 or 5 different states. And my biggest concern with the preemption is we're not taking into account the diversity that inevitably occurs in that large a populace or in that large an area. You know, what makes sense in Austin, Texas, or Houston, or Dallas won't make sense in our rural markets because our issues are different, our personalities are different, the values that we hold are different. And these preemption bills take all that away. They're a one-size-fits-all approach that doesn't make sense most often for the rural markets. And here's what's even more problematic for the rural markets. The one-size-fits-all approach are largely adopted by the major metropolitan areas, by the Dallas, Houston, Austin, and San Antonio delegations. So that means the one-size-fits-all approach and oftentimes doesn't at all address the needs or wants or desires of the rural market. And our voice in our government is being eroded daily. And that's why local control is so very, very important in the state of Texas, that we ought to be able to decide the issues in Brownwood, Texas that directly affect our citizens. I don't know everyone, obviously, in my community, but I know a good number of them. And I feel like I have a good sense and a good handle on what values they hold dear to their heart. And I know this, I know that I've lived in Abilene, I've lived in, obviously, Brownwood, I've lived in Lubbock, I've lived in Grapevine, and I worked in Dallas at one point, and lived multiple years in each of those locations. And the values and the attitudes were not the same in each of those communities. And so local control and the ability of local government is really critical. It's a fundamental concept of liberty, it is a fundamental concept of freedom, it is a fundamental concept of conservative values for local people to be able to decide local issues. So that's an overarching concern. I want to talk about just 2 issues as far as the actual bill goes. I'm going to start with the revenue caps, and I'm going to share the comments that my colleagues made about not addressing the principal issue, but I want to add a little more specificity to it. The central issue affecting property taxes in Texas is the comptroller's regulation of our property values. Just this year, the city of Brownwood, or the local taxing authority, has gotten notification that they do not believe our local appraiser has gone up on values as much as they should have gone up on values. And if they don't go up on the values, then they are going to withhold of our school funding and other state funding that may come to the city of Brownwood. And there is little doubt that the influence of the comptroller is what's pushing our appraisals up. Now, obviously that's being done because of the school funding finance system that my colleagues have talked about, and I won't belabor that point. But what's not being talked about is the fact that the representatives at the state level seem to believe that adopting the effective tax rate will solve that problem. And I'm sorry to say that it will not address that problem. What's happening in the city of Brownwood is we have, obviously indicative of rural America, we have some very affluent neighborhoods. We have some that are not as affluent. We have neighborhoods where houses sell quickly and often. We have neighborhoods where they don't ever sell or turn over. And what's happening is those neighborhoods where we have high turnover sales, new building, new construction, those folks are getting 20 and 30 and 40% increases over a 2 or 3 year period. Meanwhile, the older parts of our town are getting no increases whatsoever. So what happens is that averages out across the board, so that maybe when the city sees the actual budget, our certified tax roll may only go up by 2 to 3%. So if we adopt an effective tax rate, it's not going to change the fact that the guy who got a 30 to 40% increase in his appraisal is still going to get more than a 2.5, 3.5, or 4.5% tax increase. If we do not change the comptroller's influence on appraisals, we will not have tax relief to all of our citizens, period. The other thing I want to say just on the tax relief is when you look at it, and Mayor Adler said it well when he talked about the percentage of their budget was 50% ad valorem taxes. In Brownwood, it's 17%. So when you talk about capping revenue at 2.5%, but that revenue component is only 17% of your budget, it gets really problematic to balance the budget. Very problematic. And so what are we to do when we have cost of living increases for our employees, our firefighters? There have been years in the past where the cost of living increases we could give them wouldn't even offset the increase of their dependent care health insurance coverage. And so they're actually getting a pay decrease because we're unable to afford to give them the pay raise they actually increase or they actually need. So when you look at a 2.5% cap or even a 3.5% cap, and you realize that that cap is roughly equal to the inflationary rate we've seen in the United States for the last several years, what you're saying is that my city is the best I ever want it to be, that I never want my city to make improvement, I never want my city to be better, because all we're doing is allowing you to go up on your budget enough to offset inflation. There's simply no way we can actually make dramatic improvement on our problems. Last bill I want to talk about just briefly is the lobbying bill, and I want to give just a practical example of what we're talking about. There's a great soundbite here where people are saying that, hey, we shouldn't be using tax dollars to lobby, and that has some appeal. But when you look at the amount of tax dollars being spent, it loses its luster. I'll give you an example. In the city of Brownwood, we have a consultant that we hire. We pay him $3,500 a year. Now, we have a $34 million a year budget. So if you work that percentage out, that's the equivalent of the average guy paying about $5 a year, maybe $6, to get representation in Austin. So, folks, this is not about the amount of money that's being spent on having a voice in Austin. This is about silencing dissent. This is about our elected representatives not wanting to be told that tax caps are a bad thing. That's the elephant in the room. They don't want local representatives being here doing what we're doing today, saying that tax caps will negatively affect our residents and our constituents. I appreciate your time. It was an honor to be here.
Thank you, mayors. Now, I'm sure they'd be glad to take questions. Anybody?
I have a question. Go ahead. You were.
Yeah, the first one.
I guess it just seems like that both sides are talking past each other. You know, I understand the concerns and the rationale that the cities are mentioning, but I think, I was just pulling up all of Betancourt's press releases from the session to read again. It still doesn't get us to the issue that people are being priced out of their homes, and maybe part of the answer is that the appraisal system isn't working. But the thought that, I mean, I didn't think it totally made sense when Betancourt said on the floor he wanted his children to be able, or millennials to be able to buy a house, because obviously the problem with buying a house is the price tag on the house, not the taxes on the house, right? But I just don't feel like we've really gotten to that crux of the issue, and maybe it comes with Mayor Adler saying, you know, it's 2.5% is arbitrary. You know, 3.5% is arbitrary. Maybe it's that part. Maybe it's the appraisal district part. But I have to think that there are people who cannot afford their homes anymore, and as reporters, we have to be sensitive to that. I mean, it's not every person, and it's probably not in every single part of the town, but what are we going to do for them?
So let me address that from Austin's perspective, because what you're saying is absolutely right. In fact, there's no higher priority in Austin right now than trying to keep our city affordable. We're losing people and we're losing communities in our city. It is real difficult for someone, or for our children to be able to graduate from high school, come back from college, and then to be able to buy a home. So we're doing as much as we can. We're doing a lot of affordable housing programs. We're doing a lot of things that city governments and municipalities can step in to do to try to address affordability issues and housing issues. And a bill like this is going to stop our ability to be able to do those kinds of programs. And for why? In Austin, property values are rapidly rising, as they are all over the state. When property values rise, the city of Austin, and Travis County for that matter, can lower our tax rate and still generate a lot of money because property values are going up so much. If we were to keep our tax rates the same when property values are going up in Austin, we would be generating lots of extra money. So we don't do that. City and county have been dropping our rate as property values have been going up so that we don't generate all that extra money. We can all do that, but the school districts can't.
Right.
So while property values are going up, the school district gets punished if it lowers its rate, because the state will assume that it's getting as much money as it would have gotten had it not lowered its rate. So school districts, our finance system is built around forcing school districts to maintain their rates even when property values are going up. And then what happens to that, all that extra money that gets generated? In a property-rich school district like Austin, the state just comes in and says, boy, you generated a lot of extra money. We're going to take that money, which is why our payment for recapture has gone up $600 million, $700 million.
Austin has that much property value.
Almost $1 billion.
That's the state.
No. And I'm fine with the equity. But in a poor school district, and we have 8 of them that touch the city of Austin, it's exactly the same story. They couldn't lower their rate either. They generate a lot more money. So what does the state do when that school district generates tons more money too? The state says, now we're going to give you less because you just generated more. So the state's taking it with this hand, it's paying out less this hand, which is why the state now is contributing a lower and lower percentage of the cost. That's why it's gone from 60% to 38%. So everybody is on the same page about stopping higher property taxes. What has not been accurately communicated to people who live in Texas, the Texans, is that the property tax increase is not cities, it's not counties, it's not hospital districts, it's school
But
districts.
if I could push back, and maybe Bennett
Please.
will answer this part. I mean, I just looked at his press release where he said, for instance, Fort Worth has increased or generated an extra $13 million for the budget over the last 4 years. I mean, Senator Bettencourt came very prepared to every hearing to say, this is how much, this is the percentage you increase, this is the percentage you increase by all the cities and taxing jurisdictions. Is there, how, do you have some response to that?
Those numbers
Yes,
are
Karen.
not quite accurate because
They weren't
the numbers
fair.
that were cited were the total growth in property tax revenue in those cities over a 5-year period. The problem is that a large chunk of that is new growth in those cities, and that new growth requires new services. What he wasn't saying was what's the increase been over the effective rate, which is what happens to existing homeowners, far lower than those numbers that were cited in those hearings. Typical city, if you look at comptroller numbers going back, typical city goes up about 3.5% every year over the effective rate. Now that's different in every city, but that's the mean average. If you look at House Bill 1 right now, the current draft budget, it's anticipating school tax increases of 6.1% a year for the next 2 years of the biennium. At the same time, they're talking about capping us at 2.5%. There's your problem. Just as the mayor mentioned, we have a school system, and Mayor Haynes hit on this very accurately. If the schools don't generate that 6.1% a year, they'll come after you in the comptroller's property value study and make sure that you do. It's baked into this budget that school taxes will go up over twice the cap in House Bill 2. That's why they point the fingers at cities and counties, because they don't want it pointed out that they're the ones that are actually driving this mandated property tax increase.
I'd love to have that discussion at some point.
Yeah.
I came to the Senate hearing with Senator Bittencourt with my numbers, because I knew the numbers he was presenting. I came prepared with my numbers, and I sat there for 4 hours while he called everyone all around me, and then after 4 hours, I had to leave.
Let me give you- I can say wholeheartedly that I believe all mayors are worried about increasing property tax. As a taxpayer, I'm worried about increasing property tax. I had a discussion with my brother this weekend. He lives in a different community. We live in the same size house, built in the same year. My taxes are twice what his are. And so there's a lot of problems with the ad valorem tax issue, not to mention the least of which is it's not evenly distributed. It's not equal amongst different communities and different places in our state. I think there are some alternatives out there. I think they have to be looked at and studied. I know that Representative Green has House Bill 705, Representative Kraus has House Bill 648, that basically looks at, can we replace the ad valorem tax system at the city level with a 2% sales tax? And give some thought to that. So in the city of Brownwood, I'd have to look at the numbers and run the numbers to make sure. But in the city of Brownwood, that probably makes sense. I could probably eliminate all ad valorem taxes. And think about the impact of that. So now people are getting in my city maybe as much as a 30 to 35% tax break in one given year. And for a 2% sales tax increase. So, and more importantly, is it gets rid of this controversy between cities and school districts and the state, forever. So I think the bottom line is that there's some real flaws in the way that the ad valorem property tax system is administered that probably deserve for us to look at simply other means of funding Texas cities.
Asher Price at the Statesman. Thanks for putting this together. I have a couple of questions. First, Bennett, just bracketing this discussion about HB2 and SB2. The super preemption bill, the urban tree protection bill, these things didn't pass last session. I'm not even sure they got to the floor. There have been political changes from the 2018 midterm. So I understand these are bills that got out of the committee, but is there any concrete reason to think these pieces of legislation will get any further this time around than they got last time around?
They might, because they're being misled, they're misleading in the way they're captioned. You talk about, it took us 2 months to figure out what a noxious plant was, and we realized it was designed to sort of backdoor the tree preservation bill. These super preemption bills, they're couched in terms of, cities shouldn't double regulate occupations. Well, we don't want to double regulate just the licensing aspect. What's key to understanding these bills is they're designed to say that anything that the state licensed, the city can't regulate at all. So not just the license perspective, but these bills are literally written in a way that wouldn't let a city regulate any aspect of that business. So cities have payday lending ordinances, cities have sexually oriented business ordinances. The fact that they have a state license, we read these bills to say it's preemption. So you're right, there's been some political changes, but when you cleverly couch your bill in a way to hide the preemptive aspect of it, that's what has us the most concerned.
So the difference is fuddy-duddy language. That's why it might get further this time than last time.
On those bills, and then
I want to ask that just a quick follow-up to that
Mhm.
building material bill. What's that about? I mean, why would the home builders or whoever be pushing that?
Well,
Or whoever is pushing that?
some home builders want to build using any materials that's mentioned under the federal code, under the international
It
codes.
is.
Lubbock, for example, they've had cases where they use a special plastic piping for gas in the attic, and they had a fatality with that. So Lubbock wanted to go to a copper gas pipe,
Uh-huh.
and since that plastic pipe is legal under the federal code, this bill would prevent Lubbock from mandating a safer pipe. What happened in that house, and the testimony was interesting, sad, but lightning struck the house, and when it strikes that house, that plastic piping develops millions of tiny holes, and the gas leaked into the attic, and the homeowner opened the door and it exploded, and he was killed. And so it's home builders wanting to be able to use any materials that's in the federal code, the international code. Cities have different geographic reasons for having tougher codes. Some of the things you build walls out of in Houston would melt, in the Houston humidity.
The other thing I want to ask, sorry, guys, I want to ask one question of the mayor's, going now back to SB2 and HB2, which is that, Betancourt was evoked earlier. If you were here, he'd say, mayors, what are you worried about? This isn't a cap, this is a trigger election. You want to raise that much revenue, you got to face the voters. And so, what are you afraid of? That's what you would say here. So what are
That's
you
what he would
afraid of?
say.
I mean, what's the problem with
There are several problems with having an election that way. Start off with, if the cap is set below inflation, then I'm either cutting my budget every year or I'm having an election every year. I'm not allowed by my finance rules to enter into a long-term contract that requires me to have an intervening election in order to perform under the contract. So all the cost savings that my community gets from long-term contracts with my public safety associations and otherwise, I'm not going to be able to enter into because I can't be sure that I would win an election in any given year. Beyond that, our credit rating agencies have told us that even though they're only looking at the debt side of the property tax levy, that if there's a cap on the maintenance and operations side, they have found that that impacts cities' ability to be able to respond to things that happen. And we've been advised that Our credit rating is in jeopardy if the bill passes. Beyond that, there's just the issue of election fatigue. When I go to my voters, it's going to be something that's big. I'm going to be going to them with a large transportation bond. I'm going to be going to them with a large $250 million affordable housing bond. I can't be going to my voters every year. So to suggest that this is cured by just going to the voters every year doesn't recognize the structural problems with that as well as the practical problems.
Not to mention the cost of the election.
I have a question.
I mean,
Is there, sorry.
I was going to ask him, let me give you two practical examples of what I've learned about in a more rural market. So a couple of years ago, we had a mandate by the state to upgrade our wastewater treatment plant. It was about a $6 million repair. So what do I do if the voters don't approve the plan and the state mandates that I have to have it? And then secondly, I'll give you, yeah, so you got a second problem there. More simply, last year, and this gives you the idea of how rural we are, I suppose, but we had a wastewater, or not wastewater, but a stormwater drain collapse that happened to be underneath the corner of a gentleman's home. For us to replace that pipe was $250,000. And there was simply, I mean, so we take something like that to the voters. Well, 80% of them are not going to benefit. 90% of them are not going to benefit by replacing that storm sewer. So why would they approve something like that? But yet, it's something that the city has to do.
Rebecca?
Bennett, go ahead.
So I'm just wondering, do you guys feel like you have any legal footing to push back on these? Like, are any of these such a bridge so far that it's unconstitutional and that you can see lawsuits stemming from them? You mentioned
The cable telecom
The
bill
cable
is
one,
probably
cable.
unconstitutional. We're not allowed to give away city property for less than market value. It's exactly what this bill would do. So there would be litigation, I guarantee you, from some cities under this bill. I'm not sure silencing your critics is constitutional either. We do have a First Amendment right. These mayors all have day jobs. They don't have time to read those 7,500 bills, so they count on a skeleton staff of their organizations to do that for them. Could be constitutional problems with that. Some of the other preemption bills, I'm not so sure. I think the state does have the right to take away authority. I think it's a terrible idea, and it would cause problems for our state, but I'm not sure that can be litigated.
Bennett, the state versus cities theme has been around for at least the last several legislative sessions. Why is it reaching such a crescendo this time? What's different from previous sessions?
All of my counterparts at the other state leagues are facing some of these same bills. The tree bill, the building materials bill, the short-term rentals bills are sometimes identical down to the comma. What's happening is that some national think tanks, business think tanks, are pushing this idea that it's too much trouble to go city by city fighting regulations or even negotiating bills. Why not just go to the State House, cut cities off at the knees, and have this preemption idea? So there's always been preemption bills, but it's only been since about 2015 that we've seen this concerted effort to say that states are preeminent, states are the good guys, cities are bad, federal government's bad. I call it the Goldilocks form of government. The feds are big and bad, cities are small and bad, and somehow state government gets it just right, which can't possibly be the case, but that's what they're pushing. In some hearings, we've heard legislators say that we created cities and we can tell you what to do and we can take authority away. And we joke that, San Antonio and Nacogdoches would probably be surprised to hear that state government created them since they've been around hundreds of years before the state. But it's a national trend, Dave, and it's unfortunate. As the Mayor Adler said, cities are driving the economy right now. 74% of Texans live in Texas cities. That's where companies want to relocate. And a perfect example is, Austin and Dallas. You couldn't imagine two more different cities, yet they were both the finalists for the new Amazon headquarters, because people love their Texas cities, and they love those differences between them, and they're not concerned that Austin's a different city than Dallas, or Dallas and El Paso. That's part of the charm. And this idea that we ought to have uniformity among cities is really the opposite direction that we think we need to go.
Legislators sponsoring these bills also represent the cities that belong to your organization. Haven't you been able to exert some influence?
They are the same people that elected the Austin senators and representatives, elected Mayor Adler. Same people in San Antonio pulled the lever for Mayor Dennis. It's the same electorate. It's astonishing to think that people don't trust their mayor just as much or more than they do their state representative.
I think that's a really important point. You know, as I look at government at lots of different levels, I really think that the government is operating best at the city level. It's not polarized or partisan the way that it is at the national and state levels. The mayors that have been getting together over the last 2 months to work on the revenue cap bill have been led in significant part by the mayors of Amarillo and Lubbock, Dan Pope and Ginger Nelson, Betsy Price in Fort Worth. These are Republican mayors. At the city level, these issues are not partisan. We're trying to make government work to provide the services that our constituencies want, and we are caught in the crossfire of a partisan battle.
The other unintended consequence of that is it really makes it difficult for cities to work with their Texas legislators and actually get things done. I mean, when I was first elected mayor in 2010 in Brownwood, it was a team effort. You know, all the elected people that represented Brown County were working together for the best of Brown County. And not to say that can't happen today or doesn't happen. We recently had great help from Senator Buckingham on a bill that was important to us, and I greatly appreciate that. But it does certainly create some difficulty and some consternation between the city and legislature on working together to actually solve problems.
Mayor Adler, can you talk about the short-term rental bill a little bit and how it's going to impact what Austin's currently doing, and then maybe Mayors Dennis and Haynes can maybe talk about why a patchwork kind of quilt strategy would work best?
You know, in Austin, the risk that we face from short-term rentals is in part an affordability issue. We don't have enough housing stock in our city, so our demand is outstripping our supply. So having people that were going into neighborhoods and buying up homes with no intent to actually live there, but to use them as hotels for people that were visiting, was resulting in a situation where we were losing significant amounts of our housing stock. So a city trying to be responsive to an affordability issue adopted an ordinance to be able to deal with that. I don't understand why a city like Austin, facing that problem, that unique problem in our city, would be denied the tool to be able to most effectively deal with it. Other cities don't have that same kind of supply issue, or they don't have the same number of tourists who are trying to come in.
And just a quick follow-up, I know that was a similar bill failed last session. Do we think that it has potential to pass, and why do we think that this session?
It does have potential to pass. It had a hearing. It has a lot of supporters. That's why we're keeping the pressure on, putting it on this list. But to follow up to your other question, patchwork quilt really is a good thing, because I don't want to speak for Mayor Haynes and Dennis, but they probably don't have a short-term rental issue in their city. They have a different set of issues. The plastic bag ban was a perfect example. There's only a dozen cities that ban plastic bags. Hundreds would never dream of it, but those dozen that did it had really specific geographic and historical reasons for doing it. You had Fort Stockton, an extremely conservative West Texas community. The bags were getting in the cattle feeders and killing the cattle. South Padre Island had the same problem with marine wildlife. So this idea that one size ought to fit all at the city level just makes no sense. Cities are so different. Cities have different circumstances, and things that Mayor Adler may feel compelled to regulate, Mayor Dennis may never dream of, and vice versa. And so that speaks to the beauty of the patchwork quilt instead of it being this bad thing.
Well, but the real issue of the short-term rental bill is that you've got the realtors that have dropped in to say that if you want your house to be a short-term rental, it doesn't matter if the guy across the street has one. Those are your property rights, and I think that makes it something different than the bag ban, or, you know, it's not a patchwork thing, it's more of a property rights thing, even, I mean, I don't know how it's gonna shake out, but.
Well, cities believe in property rights. You know, I told you 74% of the population lives in Texas cities, but the surface area of Texas cities is only 4%. So you've got 74% of the folks in Texas crammed into 4% of the land. Having reasonable restrictions on what you do with your property is something that cities have done for thousands of years. And you know, I live in a residential neighborhood. I wouldn't want a liquor store or pig farm, you know, in the lot next door to me, and that is a restriction on my property rights, but it's also reasonable, and that's what cities do, is sensible regulation. And again, it's affecting Austin in ways it probably doesn't affect other cities, and they have their own issues that Austin doesn't have.
So, obviously, the last time some of these things were built, it was Fredville. Was he a former mayor or former council member? How many former council mayors types do we have in both chambers?
We did a list a few months ago, and I could share that list with you. I would say 30, 35 guys. Does that sound right? Asking some of my staff in the back. 30 to 35 current senators and representatives are former city officials. And I'll share that list with you if you'll remind me after that briefing.
On the revenue cap legislation, there were carve-outs for smaller communities at one point in the Senate bill for $15 million and less that would, protect, at least offer some sort of protection. I know they've changed it, but does that help at all in this discussion if there are carve-outs for communities that have that don't hit that $15 million threshold, which I'm assuming both of you are close to that?
Exactly. Today we are, but I think that it's very important that it's not a conquer and divide, and I think it's very important that we stand together on this issue. And so maybe it's not my particular city today, but 2 years from now it may be. So I think that carve out is just not acceptable.
I agree with Mayor Dennis, but I will also say that I think there's some logistical reasons for the carve-out. And for example, when you live in a rural community, the pressure on ad valorem taxes gets even greater because we don't have exponential growth. We don't have double-digit growth like they have in Fort Worth. And so now I have to try to figure out how to cover 2% inflation in my things that I buy with no growth or 1 or 2% growth. And so while I agree that it's not a divide and conquer, I do think there are some very fundamental reasons that the tax cap is more detrimental to rural cities than it is to metropolitan areas.
Because they've been really struggling with that, trying to figure out how to measure that out. And clearly within even the Republican caucus in the Senate and the House, they've had that issue of trying to figure out, well, we'll put the cap in there, and then they came back and said, well, we'll put a exemption, we'd have an election for everybody to see if they want to opt in. There's, depending who I talk to, some say the rural communities won't probably agree to opt in, but then others are telling me, well, but they probably will when they see how the language is written on the ballot. They would probably opt into it. Do you get a sense of how they might do that in Brownwood?
Of whether Brownwood would choose to.
Yeah, do you think if they saw that on the ballot, would they end up opting in just because it looks like a tax benefit?
I think it would be hard to get communication out clearly. And so the fear would be on our end that they would just view it as, well, I'm voting to lower my taxes. Yeah. And look, let's be honest, if you give 100 people the opportunity to lower their taxes, how many are going to vote no? Right. So the challenge for us would be, how do we effectively communicate the consequence of that vote and without it seeming like a threat or coercion?
From your perspective, within the legislature, who are the bad guys and the good guys? Who supports your position? I mean, is it a bipartisan in both directions, or?
TML is a totally bipartisan organization, Dave. That's why our mayors don't run as Republicans or Democrats. And one party may be not so favorable for us on one set of issues, but then the other party's better for us on another set of issues. So we don't say there's a good or bad side. We don't have any permanent friends or enemies. We just have folks that believe in local control, and we have those across the aisle, fortunately still. But these are some examples of where that would fall apart, and that's why we're working very closely with our legislators and hopefully stop most of these 10 ideas.
So party support or opposition kind of depends on each issue.
Maybe not even then. It's just a function of appreciating the relationship between cities and the state, and we've got friends on both sides of the aisle.
Hey, but is there anything different about the STR bill this time around, different than the one that died last legislative session?
In some ways it's worse. It was couched originally as here's the things cities can do with STRs, and it looked like it was granting authority, but what it's essentially doing was preempting all the other things. And so it's as bad as it ever has been that bill. Now, there's another bill that's good on the tax piece, which is a totally separate issue.